Okay, this video is going to teach you a little bit about single replacement reactions. But before we get to our lesson for the day on single replacement reactions, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to start off with a little love story for the day. Now that you're in the mood, our love story involves one of everyone's favorite character, Minnie Mouse. Now, of course, Disney's a magical place, and one of the big events they have at Disney that you may or may not be aware of is the Disney Prom. And it was getting close to time for the big Disney Prom, and Minnie was getting very excited. She was planning on what she was going to wear and really wanted to go. But nobody had asked her yet, and she was starting to get a little worried. Well, along comes Goofy, and Goofy thinks, you know what? I don't have anyone to go to the prom with. And so he kind of thinks about Minnie and says, boy, that Minnie's really nice. I'd like to go with her. So Goofy comes along and calls Minnie up on the phone and says, hey, Minnie, would you like to go to the prom with me? And Minnie was saying, well, no one else has asked me yet. I really would like to go. Sure, Goofy, I'll go to the prom with you. So Goofy was all excited. He was making his plans for what he was going to wear and where he was going to take Minnie to dinner. But then the next day, another guy started thinking about the prom, Donald Duck. And Donald was thinking, yeah, I sure would like to go to the prom. So he was thinking who he wanted to ask, and he thought, well, Minnie's kind of nice. So he calls Minnie up on the phone and goes, translation, Minnie, would you like to go to the prom with me? And Minnie thought about it, and she was like, well, I already told Goofy that I'd go with him. And Donald, he's asking me now. And, well, Donald, he's kind of a suave guy. He's got that little sailor outfit or whatever it is. And Goofy's nice, but he's just so goofy. And so she actually told Donald, yes, Donald, I will go to the prom with you. And so she called Goofy up and told him, sorry, Goofy, I'm not going to go to the prom with you. And, Goofy was all heartbroken. So at the end of this scene, now Minnie is planning on going to the prom with Donald. Well, and Goofy was just kind of all to himself now without a date. Well, as you can imagine, Goofy was pretty heartbroken by this. So Goofy comes along and he goes back to Minnie and he begs and pleads for Minnie to go to the prom with him. But no matter how hard he begs and pleads, he can't change Minnie's mind. Minnie says, "Well, I'm sorry, Goofy, but I'm gonna go to the prom with Donald." And so that's the way things were at the end of that scene. Well, then finally the next day, our main man decides to get his act in gear. Okay, so currently, Minnie is planning on going to the prom with Donald, but finally, Mickey decides, well, I guess it's about time to plan on going to the prom. I wonder who I should ask. Okay, so he calls Minnie up and says, hey, Minnie, would you like to go to the prom with me? Okay, that's enough of my impressions. So Minnie thinks, well, I just told Donald I was going to go to the prom with him, but, man, Mickey's the man. So she tells Mickey, sure, Mickey, I'll go to the prom with you. So she calls Donald up, says, Donald, sorry, I'm not going to the prom with you. And so she makes plans to go to the prom with Mickey. And then poor old Donald now doesn't have a date for the prom. And Donald, of course, is really heartbroken. He had plans to go with Minnie and made plans for where they were going to go and what to eat. So Donald came back and he went to Minnie and he begged and pleaded and gave her the puppy dog eyes, if a duck can do that. But no matter how hard Donald begged and pleaded, he couldn't change her mind. Mickey was going to go to the prom with Minnie. And so it didn't change. Now that's about where I lost tabs on our love story here, so I'm not sure exactly what happened at the end of the prom at Disney World. But if we understand what happened in this little love story, and we understand all the little dynamics and scenes, then we know everything there is to know about single replacement reactions. because Minnie, she kind of, we could say she was certainly very fickle here, and I'm sorry if I've demoted your picture of Minnie here through this little story, but Minnie kind of had a hierarchy of who she'd rather be with. And who she would go to the prom with, well, it depended on who was around and who had asked her and who hadn't asked her. And she kind of had this hierarchy. And Goofy was he was at the bottom of the list. If no one else was around, sure, Minnie will go to the prom with Goofy. But higher up on the list was Donald. And if Donald asked, well, he got priority over Goofy. But of course, highest up on the list was good old Mickey. So no matter who Minnie had already planned on going with, if Mickey asked, well, he's the top dog, so Minnie would go ahead and go with him. So she had this hierarchy of who she preferred to go with. Mickey was at the top of this list, and Goofy was at the bottom of this list. And looking at how this relates to single replacement reactions, we've talked about single replacement reactions involving a compound and an element. And remember that compound I think of as like a couple. So in this example, Minnie and Donald, they're kind of like our compound. And then we have a lone element, such as in this case, a lone guy like Mickey comes along. Now, just because we mix things together does not always mean we're going to have a chemical reaction. Okay, we're not always going to have a change. Just like in our love story, sometimes we switched and sometimes we had no changes. So whether there's a change or not depends on who's higher than who and who's already planning on going to the prom with Minnie and who comes along and asks. In this case, Minnie's planning on going with Donald, but now Mickey comes along. And because Mickey's higher up on the list, we do get a change. And Minnie decides, okay, yes, I'm going to go with Mickey. And then poor Donald gets the boot and he's all by himself. So if we look at our top example here, just like Minnie has a hierarchy of who she'd prefer to be with, Chlorine has a hierarchy of who Chlorine would prefer to be with. So if Chlorine would prefer to be with the aluminum, then we're going to have a change. And then the aluminum's going to combine with the chlorine, and the cobalt will get the boot and be off by its lonesome self at the end. Or the other possible scenario is, if Minnie was already with Mickey, it really didn't matter who came along. If Donald comes along, well, Donald's lower on the list. Minnie prefers to be with Mickey. So in this case, even when Donald comes along, he's not going to be able to change anything. There's going to be no change as a result of that. So if aluminum is higher up on the list than cobalt is, if cobalt comes along, well, the chlorine is already with the higher one. If it's already with the higher one, aluminum, then that means that's going to be a no change. So this list of who's higher than who is pretty important. And just like Minnie had this hierarchy of who she'd prefer to be with, nonmetals, or negative ions here, like chlorine, have a hierarchy of who they'd prefer to be with. And in our example here, we saw cobalt was at the bottom of the list, and aluminum was higher. So if the aluminum came along, the chlorine was going to go ahead and pair up with the aluminum. And who knows who else is higher up above aluminum on this list. Now this hierarchy that we've been talking about is called an activity series, and that's actually one of the things that we're going to be determining in this lab that we're going to be doing this unit, is coming up with our own activity series. And we're going to make a list of this hierarchy. And instead of preferred in terms of dates, we're talking about who is more reactive than who. So the things that are more reactive are going to be higher up on our list or our activity series, and the things that are less reactive are going to be at the bottom of our activity series. Now the way we're going to do this is by mixing things together. Now we know that when we mix things together, we don't always get a reaction. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And we're going to use that information to tell us who is higher than who. So for example, if we got some aluminum and mixed some strontium iodide with that, we would mix those together and look for signs of a reaction. Now if it reacted, that would tell us who is higher than whom. In this case, since our lone element is a metal, we need to compare it with the metal that's in the compound. So we're basically comparing aluminum to strontium here. And if it react, well, that told us who was higher. So that means that the iodine must have preferred the aluminum, and so it would have switched then to be with the aluminum, and the strontium would have gotten kicked out by itself. Okay, and of course remember that we'd have to balance all of our equations, so we get that balanced. And in this case, since it switched, And since it did react, we would know, well, the aluminum must be higher up on the list. So we would say the aluminum has the higher activity, and then the strontium would have the lower activity. Now let's say we mix those things together and it didn't react. Well, that still gives us information, because if it didn't react, that means that the iodine must have already been with the higher one. So we would know that if that one was a no reaction, we would know that the strontium was higher than the aluminum. And so that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this lab. We're going to be mixing things together, and based on whether they react or not, we're going to come up with a list of who is higher than who and build our own activity series.